Throughout the 1940s and 50s, the Caribbean island of Cuba had been America's playground. Beaches, booze, and casinos. Havana had it all. Cuba's land and industry were owned almost entirely by American corporations.
We consider part of the United States practically, just a wonderful little country over there that was of no danger to anybody. As a matter of fact, was a rather important economic asset to the United States.
Cuba's leader, Fulgencio Batista, was a brutal dictator. His people were turning against him. After years of guerrilla fighting in the mountains, a charismatic 33-year-old lawyer, Fidel Castro, entered Havana on the 8th of January 1959. Fearing the rise of a new dictator, thousands fled to exile in the United States. But to most people, Castro was a hero.
La revolución prometió empleo a la población.
The revolution promised to provide jobs for the people. It promised honesty in the administration, which had never existed in Cuba. There were health programs which had never existed before. Education programs which had never existed before.
Most important of all, Castro nationalized millions of acres of land held by American companies and gave it to the people. Eager to tell the world of his revolution, Castro flew to New York to speak at the United Nations. President Eisenhower was too busy to see him. But Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet leader, was delighted to embrace a new revolutionary and offered him economic assistance.
Cuba decided to buy oil from the Soviet Union, which would be cheaper. The country could also get credit from the Soviet Union, who were willing to help us. But the American companies refused to refine the oil.
With nowhere to refine the Soviet oil, Castro was faced with economic disaster. He sent in his militia and took over the foreign refineries in Cuba. America's retaliation was swift.
At his White House press conference, President Eisenhower announces that Cuba's assigned share of the United States sugar market has been cut by 95% in reply to what I call Fidel Castro's deliberate policy of hostility.
As tension mounted, Castro nationalized a further $1 billion worth of American investments. An irate President Eisenhower declared a complete trade embargo and ordered the CIA to recruit Cuban exiles. They would be trained to destroy Castro's regime. Over 100 people died when La Cubra, a freighter unloading arms and ammunition from Belgium, exploded in Havana harbor. CIA sabotage was suspected, but never proved. Castro turned to the Soviet Union for help.
Perhaps he might have taken a different line had the Americans been more mild towards him than they actually were. The Cold War was in its full bloom, so whatever was unpleasant to the Americans was welcomed in this country, and vice versa, I would say.
At a secret base in the Guatemalan jungle, American CIA agents had been training Cuban exiles to invade Cuba. This, they thought, would be the impetus for the Cuban people to rise up and overthrow Castro. The plan was presented to the new president, John F. Kennedy.
Kennedy felt that a plan that he had inherited, under which a band of Cuban exiles were to liberate their own country, was one he could hardly turn his back on. Surely the United States should help get rid of a communist dictatorship in our hemisphere.
The CIA badly misled the new president, promising him an easy victory and an end to the Cuban problem. Kennedy agreed to the invasion, but demanded crucial changes to hide America's involvement. Castro, seeking Soviet support, finally declared that the revolution was socialist.
Porque lo que no pueden perdonarnos los imperialistas es que estemos aquí y que hayamos hecho una revolución socialista en las propias narices de los Estados Unidos.
The following day, just 1,500 exiles, equipped with American arms and ammunition, arrived at the Bay of Pigs, 125 miles to the south of Havana.
Éramos los hombres más felices del mundo.
We were the happiest men in the world because we had the opportunity to return to Cuba, our homeland, to fight to rescue freedom and democracy so that our country could be for all Cubans.
Without American air support or resupply, the invasion force was outnumbered and outgunned. Within 72 hours, the invaders were either captured or dead. Castro had survived and humiliated Kennedy. The CIA was told to think again.
Our job was to start to come up with new plans, not a Bay of Pigs type plans, but new plans to, quote, get rid of Castro and the Castro regime, unquote.
Everything was suggested, from assassination to spraying LSD into a television studio to make it seem as if Fidel had gone mad. Whatever they tried, Castro took in his stride. More secure within his own country, he sought to export revolution to the rest of Latin America. Alarmed by this prospect, America kept up the pressure on Castro. In the spring of 1962, a practice invasion of a Caribbean island was mounted by 40,000 American Marines.
We did that purposely to make Castro pay more attention to that than causing trouble in Latin and Central America. But the Cubans and the Russians, they told us later, believed that the United States really did intend to attack Cuba, and therefore Castro kept saying, I need some help.
Castro's pleas inspired the Soviet leader Khrushchev to make a daring offer. He had boasted to the world of Russia's nuclear strength, but in reality, he knew just how limited his long-range missile force really was. But he did have medium-range nuclear missiles.
From the territory of the Soviet Union, they couldn't possibly reach the territory of the USA. But deployed on Cuba, they would become strategic nuclear weapons. That meant, in practical terms, we had a chance to narrow the differences between our forces.
I immediately appreciated the strategic importance of the presence of those missiles in Cuba. By that time, the Americans had already transported similar missiles to Turkey. I thought, if we expected the Soviets to fight on our behalf, to run risks for us, and even involve themselves in a war for our sake, it would be immoral and cowardly on our part to refuse to accept the presence of those missiles here.
In July 1962, under the nose of the Americans, the first of 150 Soviet ships, loaded with heavily disguised nuclear missiles and over 40,000 troops, sailed for Cuba.